What if the ground beneath your feet, the very soil you call home, was never truly yours? For decades, we have been told a story of charity, of a hand reaching down to lift a continent out of the dust. But stories told by the powerful often hide a sharper edge. In the heart of West Africa, a young man in a faded camouflage uniform and a simple red beret stood before a microphone, looking not at the cameras, but at the souls of his people. He did not speak of debt or the need for more loans. He spoke of bread. He spoke of dignity. And in that moment, the air in Burkina Faso changed. At 5 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, a farmer in the northern province of Yatenga began to sharpen his hoe. He did not look at the sky for rain, but at the horizon for hope. For years, he had been told that his land was too dry, his seeds too weak, and his future dependent on a sack of grain stamped with a foreign flag. They called it assistance. But the records show a different truth. They show a cycle of dependency that kept the granaries empty and the spirit broken. That was until Ibrahim Traore refused to accept the script written for him in distant offices. This is not just about a change in leadership. It is about a change in the very definition of what it means to be free. It is about the moment a nation decided that it would rather eat the bitter fruit of its own labor than the sweetened crumbs from a stranger's table. Stay with me. What comes next affects all of us, for it challenges the very foundation of how the world operates. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this resonates, show your support with a like, comment, or subscription. It keeps the story alive. The name Burkina Faso translates to the land of upright men. It is a title that carries the weight of a mountain. Yet, for nearly 30 years, that mountain seemed to be crumbling. Political instability, the creeping shadow of insurgency, and an economy tethered to the whims of former colonial masters had left the people weary. The youth, who make up the vast majority of the population, looked at their elders and saw a reflection of unfulfilled promises. The world saw a landlocked country struggling to survive, but Ibrahim Traore saw a fortress waiting to be rebuilt. When he took power, he did not move into a palace. He stayed in the barracks. He did not demand a motorcade of luxury cars. He rode in the back of rugged trucks. These small details moved the hearts of the elderly, those who remembered a time when leadership meant sacrifice, not excess. He understood that before you can ask a people to toil in the fields, you must show them that you are willing to bleed in the trenches. The first challenge was not military, though the borders were under threat. The first challenge was the stomach. For too long, the nation had relied on imported grain, a system that effectively outsourced the survival of Burkinabe citizens to international markets. Ibrahim Traore looked at the vast, sun-drenched plains and asked a simple yet radical question: why are we buying what we can grow? The global powers responded with a familiar refrain. They spoke of efficiency, of comparative advantage, and of the necessity of global trade. But beneath the academic language lay a cold reality. If you do not control your food, you do not control your vote. If you cannot feed your children, you cannot look your oppressor in the eye. Traore's vision was a direct threat to the status quo. He began by reallocating resources from bloated administrative budgets directly to the smallholder farmers. He did not just send money, he sent the army, not to fight, but to farm. Imagine the sight of soldiers, their rifles set aside, operating tractors and digging irrigation canals. This was the first micro-payoff of his administration, the realization that the national defense was not just about bullets, but about barley and beans. Within the first 6 months, the morale of the countryside began to shift. The silence of the abandoned fields was replaced by the hum of activity. But the road to sovereignty is paved with more than just good intentions. As Traore moved to secure the agricultural heartland, the international financial institutions began to tighten their grip. They spoke of fiscal responsibility and market stability. In reality, they were watching their leverage evaporate. A self-sufficient Burkina Faso is a Burkina Faso that no longer needs to say yes to every demand from Washington or Paris. The young leader knew that he was opening a loop that could not easily be closed. He promised a harvest that would require no foreign aid, a feat that experts claimed was impossible given the climate and the lack of modern infrastructure. Yet, he moved forward with a quiet intensity that defied the doubters. He focused on indigenous seeds, those that had survived in the Sahel for centuries, rather than the genetically modified varieties pushed by multinational corporations. He was betting the future of his nation on the strength of its own heritage. As the first rains of the season began to fall, the tension in the capital of Ouagadougou was palpable. The elite whispered about the risks of alienating the West. They worried about the loss of luxury imports and the cooling of diplomatic relations. But in the markets, the tone was different. The price of locally grown maize began to stabilize. The upright men were beginning to stand a little taller. Traore's approach was a masterclass in pattern interruption. While other leaders traveled the world begging for investment, he stayed home, walking the rows of newly planted sorghum. He showed that the true wealth of a nation is not found in its central bank, but in the calloused hands of its people. This was a radical departure from the norm, a refusal to play the role of the humble petitioner. Yet, even as the crops began to sprout, a deeper mystery remained. Traore often spoke of a hidden enemy, one that lived within the very systems designed to help the nation. He hinted that the greatest threat to Burkinabe independence was not the terrorist in the desert, but the contract in the boardroom. This was a loop he intended to close, but the cost of doing so would be higher than anyone anticipated. He was not just fighting for a better harvest. He was fighting for the memory of those who had tried this before and failed or were stopped. The ghost of Thomas Sankara, the legendary leader who was assassinated for similar dreams, seemed to haunt the corridors of power. But where Sankara had been a fiery orator, Traore was a man of few words and decisive action. He knew that the world was watching, waiting for him to stumble, waiting for the hunger to return so they could say, "We told you so," but the hunger did not return. Instead, something else began to grow, a sense of collective ownership. When a bridge was built, it was built by Burkinabe engineers. When a school was opened, it was funded by local taxes, not foreign grants. The nation was learning to breathe on its own, and the sensation was intoxicating. As we reach the end of this first chapter, the foundation has been laid. The seeds are in the ground, and the people are behind their leader. But the international community is not known for its patience or its kindness toward those who break the rules. The revelation that is coming will shake the very idea of international cooperation to its core. Ibrahim Traore has made his opening move. He has challenged the giants of global trade and the architects of dependency. But as any old farmer will tell you, planting the seed is the easy part. It is the harvest that tests a man's soul. And what Traore discovered in the dark corners of the national accounts would change the way he viewed his allies and his enemies forever. He was about to reveal a shock that no one saw coming, a truth that had been buried under decades of paperwork and polite diplomatic smiles. The shock that Ibrahim Traore uncovered was not a simple error in bookkeeping. It was a calculated architecture of poverty. As the young leader peeled back the layers of previous administrations, he found that nearly 70% of the nation's agricultural budget was tied to interest payments for machinery that did not work and seeds that would not grow. The loops of dependency were not accidental. They were the design. While the world watched the surface, Traore began to dismantle the machinery of the old guard. He closed the first loop by proving that the promise of a harvest without foreign aid was not a dream, but a matter of national will. In the dusty plains of the Bagre Polder, the transformation became visible. For years, this land was a symbol of failed promises, a place where multinational firms had started projects only to abandon them when the subsidies dried up. Traore changed the pattern. He deployed the military engineering corps to complete irrigation canals that had sat dry for a decade. He did not ask for a new loan to finish the work. Instead, he reclaimed funds from ghost projects and redirected them to the men in the mud. By the end of the first season, the water flowed, the grain grew, the loop of food insecurity began to tighten, then snap. This success was a direct blow to the weaponized food systems that had long dominated the region. When you produce your own grain, the bags of soy and corn from across the ocean lose their power. They are no longer a lifeline, they become a burden on the local market. Traore understood that to be truly free, Burkina Faso had to reject the toxic generosity of the past. He stopped the dumping of surplus foreign crops that had historically suppressed local prices and driven Burkinabe farmers into debt. The dignity of the harvest was being restored, 1 hectare at a time. Leave a thank you in the comments to Ibrahim Traore, or simply thank you for hope. Each thank you carries weight. Each says, I hear this, I stand with this. Write your thank you now. To understand why this was so revolutionary, one must look at the specific details of the change. In one province, the production of rice tripled within a single year. This was achieved not through high-tech imports, but through a return to community-led farming supported by state-funded fertilizer plants. Traore was proving that the African soil was not the problem. The problem was the invisible fence built around it by global trade rules. As the silos filled, the psychological impact on the nation was profound. For the first time in a generation, the elderly did not have to worry if the next shipment from the coast would arrive on time. One elderly woman in a small village near the border of Mali spoke of this shift. She recalled how, for 40 years, she had watched her sons leave for the cities because the farm could not sustain them. Now, her youngest had returned. He was not there to hide from the conflict, but to work the land. Traore had made farming a matter of national service and pride. This was a micro payoff that no economic chart could fully capture: the restoration of the African family unit through the stability of the soil. However, as the belly of the nation became full, a new shadow began to loom. The international community, which had long preached about the virtues of self-sufficiency, suddenly became quiet. The upright men were becoming too upright for the comfort of those who preferred them on their knees. A second loop began to open: the ghost of Thomas Sankara. People started to notice the parallels. Like Sankara, Traore was walking among the poor, driving his own vehicle, and challenging the hegemony of the old colonial currency. The paradox was clear. The West often claims to want an Africa that can feed itself, but a self-sufficient Africa is an Africa that can say no. And Burkina Faso was starting to say no very loudly. They said no to lopsided mining contracts. They said no to military bases that provided no security. They said no to the idea that their future must be managed by experts in Europe. The tension was no longer about wheat and corn. It was about the very survival of the neo-colonial order in the Sahel. Traore's government began to look for new allies, those who understood the scars of the past. He reached out to nations like Brazil, which had faced similar agricultural hurdles, and India, which had mastered the art of low-cost, high-yield farming in arid climates. By diversifying his partnerships, he was ensuring that the nation would never again be held hostage by a single source of credit or grain. This was not a shift in masters, but an expansion of freedom. But the reaction from the established powers was swift. They began to whisper about instability and authoritarianism. They raised the specter of sanctions, hoping to frighten the population into submission. They assumed that the people of Burkina Faso would value their ties to the global financial system more than their own sovereignty. It was a massive miscalculation. The people had already tasted the bread grown in their own soil, and they found it far more satisfying than the aid they had been fed for 30 years. Traore knew that the pressure would only increase. He warned his people that the coming months would be a test of their endurance. He spoke of the bitter price of liberty, a phrase that resonated deeply with the elders who had lived through the highs of the 80s and the long, cold winter that followed. He was preparing them for a confrontation that would go beyond the borders of their country. As this second chapter draws to a close, the paradox has been established. Burkina Faso is wealthier in spirit and food than it has been in decades, yet it is more isolated from the traditional corridors of power. The loops of history are circling back. The same forces that sought to extinguish the light of independence 40 years ago are gathering again. They are watching, waiting for a moment of weakness, a crack in the unity of the upright men. But Traore has a plan for the coming storm. He has already begun to move the nation's gold reserves and rethink the very nature of their currency. He is about to make a choice that will force the hand of his enemies. The next stage of this journey involves a confrontation so direct, so public, that it will leave no room for neutrality. The world is about to see what happens when a young leader decides that his people's dignity is worth more than the approval of the world's elite. The stage is set for a clash of wills that will determine the fate of the Sahel for the next 50 years. The pressure from the global north did not arrive as a storm, but as a slow, freezing fog. International banks began to stall transactions, and diplomatic cables grew cold. They expected the young leader to flinch when the numbers on the screen turned red. But Ibrahim Traore had already closed the second loop. He knew that the ghost of the past could only haunt those who feared it. He turned his gaze away from the glass towers of the West and toward the red earth of his own land. He understood that the greatest threat to his revolution was not a lack of foreign currency, but a lack of courage. He chose to double down on the sovereignty of the upright men, even as the walls of the global financial system began to close in. The reaction from the institutions was textbook. They cited governance risks to justify the withdrawal of support. But for the people of Burkina Faso, these were merely words used to mask the theft of their autonomy. Traore responded by launching an internal sovereign fund. He asked the citizens, from the wealthy merchants in the city to the street vendors, to invest in their own country. This was a pivotal moment of emotional escalation. In a small town in the south, an elderly veteran of the colonial wars walked into a government office and handed over his entire pension. He said he would rather die hungry and free than live full and enslaved. This spirit became the new currency of the nation. While the West looked for ways to punish the regime, Traore was busy building a new web of alliances. He looked toward the global south, engaging with partners who offered technology and trade without the baggage of moral lectures. Brazil provided the expertise to turn the savannah into a breadbasket, while India shared the blueprints for small-scale industrialization. These were not acts of charity, they were partnerships of equals. The blockade intended to starve the revolution only served to strengthen its resolve. Burkina Faso was no longer a lone voice. It was becoming the heartbeat of a regional movement for total independence. If this channel has moved you, consider becoming a member, not for perks, but because supporting this directly supports narratives mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for the Black Stallion's mission. The struggle soon moved from the fields to the high-stakes arena of international diplomacy. At a major summit, Traore stood alone against a phalanx of seasoned politicians. They spoke of rules-based order, but he spoke of the blood of his ancestors. He pointed out the hypocrisy of nations that preached democracy while engineering the economic collapse of those who dared to practice it. This confrontation was the peak of the third phase. He did not shout. He did not need to. The quiet weight of his words, backed by the reality of a nation that was feeding itself, made the suits in the room look fragile. He was closing the loop of psychological inferiority that had plagued the continent for a century. As the sanctions deepened, the ingenuity of the Burkinabe people reached new heights. When they could no longer import expensive spare parts, they built their own foundries. When foreign fuel became a weapon of blackmail, they accelerated their solar projects. Every obstacle became an opportunity for a micro-payoff in national pride. The youth, once desperate to leave for Europe, were now competing to see who could innovate the fastest in the labs of Ouagadougou. The pressure was not breaking the people. It was tempering them like steel. However, the path of the pioneer is never smooth. Inside the country, the old guard, those who had grown rich off the crumbs of neocolonialism, began to conspire. They missed the ease of the old ways, the kickbacks from foreign contracts, and the safety of their overseas accounts. Traore faced a choice: to compromise for the sake of internal stability or to purge the rot and risk a backlash. He chose the latter, declaring that a house built on sand cannot weather a storm. He began a transparent audit of all national assets, revealing the depth of the betrayal by the previous elite. The air grew heavy with the scent of a coming showdown. Rumors of a funded coup began to circulate in the capital. The international press, ever eager to see a defiant African leader fail, began to write his political obituary. They spoke of growing unrest, ignoring the thousands who marched in support of the Black Stallion. Traore stayed calm, continuing his tours of the rural provinces, often sleeping in the same tents as his soldiers. He knew that his safety lay not in bodyguards, but in the collective will of those who finally felt the dignity of their own labor. As we reach the conclusion of this third segment, the tension has reached a breaking point. Burkina Faso is no longer just a country. It is a laboratory for a new African century. The loops of agricultural and psychological dependency have been severed, but the ultimate test remains. The forces of the old world are preparing a final, desperate move to reclaim their lost territory. They are not just fighting for a piece of land, they are fighting to stop an idea from spreading. Traore has led his people to the edge of the promised land, but the gates are still guarded by the giants of the past. The final confrontation will not be fought with tractors or seeds, but with the very identity of the nation. Will the upright men hold their ground when the full weight of the empire is brought to bear? Or will the shadows of the past finally catch up to the young man in the red beret? The answers lie in the final harvest, a reckoning that will echo far beyond the borders of the Sahel. The loop is almost closed, and the world is holding its breath. The final harvest arrived not as a quiet gathering of grain, but as a roar of defiance that echoed across the entire continent. Ibrahim Traore had done what the architects of dependency said was impossible. He had led a nation from the brink of starvation to the pinnacle of sovereignty. As the sun set over the vast golden fields of the Sahel, the loops of the past were finally closed. The records no longer showed a country begging for crumbs. They showed a people who had reclaimed their seat at the table of humanity. This was the moment of absolute payoff, where the sweat of the farmer and the vision of the leader merged into a single, unbreakable reality. The success of Burkina Faso began to spread like wildfire. The regional neighbors, long trapped in the same cycles of debt and doubt, looked across the border and saw a mirror of what they could become. Traore's model of self-reliance was no longer a theory. It was a visible, breathing victory. This was the greatest fear of the old empires, not that one small nation would succeed, but that its success would be contagious. The upright men had proven that the chains of the past were made of paper, and all it took to break them was the courage to stand tall. The geopolitical map was being rewritten by those who actually lived on the land, right where you're watching from your city, your corner of the world. The Black Stallion sends each of you a heartfelt wish. May your journey be filled with dignity, hope, and light. In the final reckoning, the numbers spoke louder than any diplomatic speech. The production of staple crops had reached levels unseen in 40 years. The reliance on foreign fertilizer had been replaced by local innovation, and the national treasury was growing, fed by the honest labor of its citizens. But the true victory was found in the eyes of the youth. They no longer looked to the horizon for a boat to carry them away. They looked to the soil for a future to build. Traore had given them back their heritage. He had shown them that the most valuable resource in Africa is not the gold in the ground, but the fire in the hearts of its people. As we look to the future, the risks remain, but they are no longer the risks of a victim. They are the challenges of a pioneer. If the current success is just the beginning of a larger movement, what happens when the rest of the continent decides to follow suit? The world is witnessing a rupture in history. The old guard may still linger in their boardrooms, but their power to dictate the lives of the upright men has evaporated. Sovereignty is no longer a dream. It is the daily bread of Burkina Faso. What you've just heard isn't simply history. It's a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still alive. If this moved you, subscribe. Not for numbers, but because we're building a space where voices of independence are honored. We are creating a community that values truth over convenience and courage over compliance. Your support ensures that the story of Ibrahim Traore and the people of Burkina Faso continues to inspire generations yet to come. Join us in this mission to celebrate the strength of the human spirit. 500 days of transformation have led to this point. Ibrahim Traore and the people of Burkina Faso have achieved what many thought was a fantasy, and the result is a nation that finally breathes its own air. You may not remember every speech or every statistic, but you will remember the feeling of a people who refused to be forgotten. You will remember the sight of a young leader who chose his people over his own safety. This is the legacy of the Black Stallion, a story of iron will and red earth. What would you choose if you were forced to decide between a full stomach and a free soul? For the people of Burkina Faso, the answer was to have both, and they were willing to work for it. Their journey reminds us that no empire is eternal and no people are truly powerless. As Ibrahim Traore continues to navigate the complex waters of international relations, his foundation remains the soil of his home. The story of Burkina Faso is a beacon for every nation striving for its own version of independence. Ibrahim Traore has shown that one man with a clear vision can change the course of history. In Burkina Faso, the revolution is not televised. It is harvested. It is found in the laughter of children who are well fed and the pride of elders who are finally respected. The mission is far from over, but the direction is clear. The land of upright men is standing tall once again, and the world can no longer look away. This is the new Africa, born from the soil and destined for the stars.